Tom Jensen sat alone in his office, the steady hum of fluorescent lights above him, a constant reminder of the endless paperwork and monotonous life he'd grown used to. His uniform, now replaced by a civilian outfit, felt like a distant memory. He wasn't the agent he once was, the man who would leap into action at the sound of a gunshot, his loyal K9 partner at his side, ready for anything. But now it was just paperwork, briefings and more paperwork. The sound of a soft ping from his computer screen caught his attention. He had long since stopped checking the news, but the name that flashed on the screen forced him to pause. Apollo, it read. The dog he had served with for nearly half a decade. His heart stopped for a split second. No, it couldn't be. A wave of dread washed over him as he clicked the notification. What he saw shattered everything he had known about loyalty and service. Apollo was listed in a high kill shelter, deemed unadoptable and labeled as aggressive. His fate was sealed. Euthanasia was the next step. Tom's breath hitched, and 1,000 memories flooded his mind. He could still feel Apollo's warmth next to him as they shared quiet moments in the car, the deep bond they had forged over years of life and death missions. They had been brothers in arms, and Apollo had always had his back without hesitation. And now Apollo was nothing more than a number on a death row list, the dog who had saved his life countless times, the one who had pulled him out of danger, was to be discarded like garbage. Tom couldn't accept it. His heart raced with anger, guilt, and a determination he hadn't felt in years. Without a second thought, Tom picked up the phone. His hands shook as he dialed the number listed in the report. There was no time for questions, no time to waste. His partner, his friend, needed him. The road stretched out before him, endless and dark. Tom's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles pale in the moonlight. The silence in the car was deafening, punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of papers strewn across the passenger seat. It was a strange comfort, that silence. It reminded him of the quiet moments he had spent with Apollo, moments where the world outside didn't matter. But now, everything had changed. The phone call had been brief, too brief. The shelter confirmed that Apollo was there, locked behind cold metal bars, his future hanging by a thread. They had offered little in the way of reassurance. Unadoptable, they had said. Aggressive, they had said. Tom didn't care. Apollo was none of those things. He knew the dog better than anyone. He had seen Apollo's loyalty, his bravery, his heart. None of that could be erased by a label. As the headlights of his car cut through the dark, Tom's mind raced. What if Apollo didn't recognize him? What if the dog had been so broken, so damaged by the years of neglect and abandonment, that he had forgotten the bond they had shared? The thought was unbearable, but Tom wouldn't let that stop him. He had rescued Apollo once before, and now it was his turn to return the favor. He pushed the accelerator down harder, the car speeding down the road, the destination unclear, but the purpose undeniable. Tom's breath was shallow as he stood in front of the shelter. It was a small, decrepit building, far from the bright, sterile facilities he had imagined when he thought of places where dogs like Apollo might end up. This was no place for a hero, no place for the K9 who had saved so many lives, who had faced danger without flinching. Inside, the smell of urine and bleach filled the air. The sound of barking dogs echoed through the building, a constant reminder of the lives waiting to be thrown away. Tom took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The shelter worker at the front desk barely looked up as he entered. She didn't know him and he didn't care. He was here for one reason and one reason only. Apollo. "I'm here to see Apollo," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight. 12 years of experience. He wasn't going to back down, not this time. The worker glanced at him with indifference. "That's the dog in the back," she said, not bothering to even check the computer screen. "He's marked for euthanasia." Tom's stomach churned at the words. Marked for euthanasia. It was as if they were talking about a piece of property, not a living, breathing being who had given everything to his country, his people. He didn't wait for another word. Tom marched past the desk, his steps quickening as he neared the back of the building. He had no time to argue, no time to wait for permission. Apollo was in there, and he was getting him out. The back room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of despair. In the farthest cage, he saw him the familiar, stoic face of Apollo, but something was wrong. The dog's eyes were dull, lifeless, as he lay curled up in the corner, barely moving. Tom's heart sank as he approached. "Apollo," he whispered, the name coming out as a breath. "Apollo, it's me, it's Tom. It's..." For a moment, there was nothing, just the heavy silence that filled the room. And then a slight movement. Apollo's ears perked up, and his head lifted just slightly. He blinked, his gaze focusing on Tom. It was slow, but it was unmistakable. The recognition, the bond that had never truly broken. "Apollo," Tom said again, his voice thick with emotion. "You remember me, don't you?" The seconds stretched into an eternity. In that moment, everything Tom had feared, everything he had worried about, whether Apollo would remember him, whether the dog had been too damaged to trust again, melted away. There was a flicker in Apollo's eyes, a small but unmistakable spark of recognition. Tom stepped forward, his hands trembling. He reached out and stroked the dog's head, feeling the familiar warmth of his fur. The dog, despite everything, leaned into his touch, the weight of years of loyalty not forgotten. The dog had been abandoned, but the bond was still there. Tom knew this moment was just the beginning. There would be hurdles, there would be bureaucracy to fight, but there was no way he was leaving without Apollo. He would fight for him. He would fight for every dog that had been left behind, forgotten by the system that was supposed to protect them. But as he stood there, his heart swelling with relief and gratitude, he couldn't help but think about what Apollo had been through. How had they let this happen? How had they allowed a hero like Apollo to be treated like this, discarded as though he was nothing? The shelter worker stared at Tom, her face unreadable. "I'm sorry, sir, but the decision has been made. Apollo is unadoptable. He's aggressive. We can't keep him any longer." Tom felt the rage building inside him, but he kept it in check. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You don't know him. He's not aggressive. He's a hero." The worker shrugged, her indifference cutting deeper than any words could. "I'm just following orders." Tom took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let this happen. He wasn't going to walk away from Apollo again, not after everything they had been through together. "I'm not leaving without him," he said firmly. He spent the next few hours doing what he did best, fighting the system. He called, he emailed, he went over the head of the shelter staff. He spoke to his old colleagues in the military, his contacts in law enforcement, anyone who would listen. Slowly, word spread. A petition was started. People began to take notice. Apollo's story became a rallying cry. The public's support grew stronger with every passing hour. The shelter had underestimated the power of one man's determination, the loyalty of a dog who had never once backed down. Days passed, and the fight continued. Tom could barely sleep, barely eat, but he couldn't stop. Every minute Apollo spent in that shelter was another minute too long. And then one day, the call came. "Mr. Jensen?" It was the shelter worker. "We've had a lot of support. We've reconsidered. Apollo is free to go." Tom's heart skipped a beat. It had worked. The system had bent, and Apollo was coming home. The day Tom walked into the shelter to retrieve Apollo was a day he would never forget. Apollo, though thin and worn, was still the same dog, the dog who had stood by his side in the worst of times. The dog who had never once given up on him. The reunion was quiet, full of emotion, full of tears. Apollo leaned into Tom, his tail wagging weakly, but it was enough. It was everything. And as they walked out of the shelter together, side by side, Tom knew that the fight had been worth it. Not just for Apollo, but for every other K9 who had been left behind, forgotten. The system had failed them, but they had each other, and together they would never be broken. What began as a rescue mission turned into a movement to honor the heroes, the dogs who had given their all for their country, only to be cast aside when their service was over. And Tom Jensen, with Apollo by his side, became the symbol of that change. They were no longer just a handler and a dog. They were partners in every sense of the word, their bond stronger than ever before, proving that even in the face of betrayal, Loyalty would always prevail. The story of Apollo's rescue spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with support. News outlets picked up the story, calling it a miraculous reunion and a testament to the bond between military canines and their handlers. But for Tom, it wasn't just about the public recognition. It was about doing what was right, about making sure Apollo, and every canine like him, was treated with the respect they deserved. Tom sat in his small, modest living room, Apollo resting his head on Tom's lap. The dog's eyes, once filled with fear and confusion, were now calm. The flicker of recognition had grown into something deeper: trust. Apollo had never been given the luxury of peace until now. And Tom, who had long ago lost his sense of peace in the chaos of the job, now found it again in the quiet moments shared with his partner. The public support, though appreciated, didn't change the underlying issue. Too many military working dogs were being discarded. Too many were left to rot in shelters with little regard for their service. But Tom wasn't the type to let something go. He had a cause now, one that would honor Apollo and the thousands of canines who had sacrificed everything only to be abandoned. It didn't take long for Tom to rally a group of veterans, animal rights activists, and law enforcement officials. They created a foundation in Apollo's name, dedicated to advocating for retired military canines. It wasn't just about saving one dog. It was about making sure no other dog would have to face the fate Apollo had. The foundation grew, and with it the message spread: heroes don't die alone. As the foundation gained traction, Tom's inbox was flooded with messages. Messages from people who had adopted retired canines, from people who wanted to help, from those who had experienced the same horror and heartbreak. But it wasn't just the public that took notice. Lawmakers began to listen. Conversations about the treatment of retired military dogs started happening in the halls of Congress. Tom and Apollo became symbols of resilience, the perfect embodiment of the unbroken bond between a soldier and their dog. But it wasn't just about their personal journey. It was about sparking a nationwide change in how military canines were treated after their service ended. One evening, Tom stood in front of a crowded room in Washington, D.C. It was a rare occasion. For him, his world had always been more about action and less about speeches. But the time had come to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. "Apollo saved my life more times than I can count," Tom began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "And when his service ended, he wasn't treated as a hero. He was discarded. But it's not just about Apollo, it's about every dog that has ever served. They give everything they have to protect us, and when their service is over, they deserve better than being left to die in a shelter." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Tom didn't need to say much more. The images of Apollo, his eyes full of recognition as he was rescued, his tail wagging weakly after years of neglect, spoke louder than any politician ever could. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Tom felt like he had done something that mattered. The foundation's work had only just begun, but the seeds of change had been planted. The story of Apollo had sparked a fire that no one could extinguish, and in the coming months, laws were changed, funding was allocated, and the system began to shift. The first of many new programs for retired military canines was announced. Shelters were given funding to care for military dogs after their service, and strict regulations were put in place to ensure that canines like Apollo wouldn't be abandoned. It was a victory, but it didn't stop there. Tom's life, once filled with the chaos of criminal pursuits and dangerous operations, was now focused on a new mission, one of compassion, justice, and love. The transition hadn't been easy. His former colleagues saw him as a symbol of hope, a reminder that the work they had done together was about something bigger than themselves. And Apollo, his constant companion, was right there with him every step of the way. Months passed since Apollo's rescue, and while Tom's work continued to be busy with the foundation, he knew deep down that his bond with the dog had been sealed in a way that couldn't be broken. But life, it seemed, had one last test for them. One afternoon, Tom received a phone call. A notorious criminal, one who had escaped capture years ago, had been spotted near a remote location. Law enforcement was closing in, but this criminal was dangerous, armed, and cornered. They needed backup, and they needed a canine. Tom's first instinct was to say no. Apollo had been through enough. He had retired, and Tom wasn't sure he could put the dog in harm's way again. But the call came, through again, this time with urgency. The criminal was desperate, and he was known for using hostages to make his escape. Without hesitation, Tom grabbed Apollo's leash and headed out to the scene. It wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about a loyalty that went both ways. Apollo had saved him countless times. Now it was time to return the favor. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. Police cars surrounded the area, but the criminal was cornered in a house and a standoff had begun. The hostage, a young woman, was inside, and her life was on the line. The authorities were waiting for the criminal to make a mistake. Tom's heart raced as he unhooked Apollo's leash. "We've got this, buddy," he whispered. Apollo's ears perked up as they neared the building. The dog's instincts were sharp, his focus unwavering. Together, they had taken on impossible odds before, and this time would be no different. The two of them, partners once again, moved in. The standoff was tense, but Apollo's sense of smell and acute hearing picked up the slightest sound. Tom watched as Apollo moved forward, his body low to the ground, focused entirely on the task at hand. The criminal was nearby, and Apollo could sense his presence. Suddenly, the criminal lunged, trying to flee with the hostage in tow. Before Tom could react, Apollo was already in motion. In an instant, the dog had tackled the criminal to the ground, restraining him with precise, calculated force. The police rushed in to make the arrest, but the real hero was Apollo. As the police secured the area, Tom knelt beside Apollo, his heart pounding with pride. The dog had done it again. He had saved a life just as he had done countless times before, without a second thought. The following day, a ceremony was held in honor of Apollo's bravery. This time, the world was watching. What had once been a quiet rescue mission had turned into a movement. Apollo's name was no longer just known to Tom. It was known to millions. The venue was grand, an auditorium filled with officials, veterans, animal rights activists, and a crowd of people whose lives had been touched by Apollo's story. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and as the spotlight shifted to the stage, all eyes were on the man and his dog. Apollo walked slowly by Tom's side, his tail wagging weakly but with pride. The years of service, the struggles, and the ultimate triumph had taken their toll on the dog, but there was an undeniable strength in him, a strength that mirrored the man beside him. At the ceremony, the audience rose to their feet as Apollo was presented with an award for his bravery. The applause was deafening, a roar of gratitude and recognition. Tom stood tall beside Apollo, his heart swelling with pride. He glanced down at his partner, the dog who had been through hell and back, who had faced death time and time again, and still, despite everything, stood by him. Apollo had saved his life more times than he could count, but this time he had saved a life that mattered to so many others. As the room erupted in applause, Tom realized something profound. Apollo had never just been a dog. He was more than a crime-fighting partner. Apollo symbolized the sacrifices made by many animals, often forgotten once their work was done. In that moment, Tom saw it clearly, the countless canines abandoned without recognition. But Apollo had changed everything. Tom looked down at Apollo, their gazes locking, and in that instant the world around them faded. It was just the two of them, bound by years of loyalty, trust, and danger. "You did it, buddy," Tom whispered, his voice full of emotion. "You saved us all." The applause continued, but in that moment, it was just Tom and Apollo, a man and his dog, sharing a bond forged through battles, victories, and hardships. They had endured together, and Tom knew it had all been worth it. The world had finally recognized Apollo's courage, and in doing so acknowledged the silent heroes who served selflessly. Together, they had faced death and betrayal, but found redemption. Apollo, once seen as just a tool, was now a hero. Tom, who had stood by him, had rediscovered his purpose in fighting for those who couldn't speak for themselves. As the ceremony ended, Tom and Apollo walked off the stage, heads held high. Apollo had changed the narrative, showing the world that true partnership was unbreakable. Backstage in the quiet, Tom crouched down, looking Apollo in the eye. "I thought I lost you forever," he whispered. "But you were never lost, were you? You were just waiting for me to find you again." Apollo's eyes softened, and Tom knew the dog understood. They were brothers, and nothing could break their bond. What began with Apollo's rescue had grown into something bigger. Tom's foundation, named after Apollo, had passed laws, reformed shelters, and ensured that retired K9s were honored as heroes. The fight wasn't over, but with Apollo by his side, Tom felt invincible. The abandoned dog had become a symbol of loyalty, courage, and the bond between a man and his dog. Together, they would continue to fight for the rights of military K9s. As night fell and Apollo curled up at Tom's feet, Tom smiled, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, unbroken, unyielding, forever.